Good afternoon and welcome to an in-training webinar from InAlliance. This is one in a series that we're conducting exclusively for the Illinois Main Street program and its communities. My name is Darius Bryjka. I'm a principal with InAlliance and I'll be conducting the session this afternoon. So May is National Historic Preservation Month, and because of that we'll be presenting two preservation-based webinars during May, and today we'll discuss the importance of historic designation for your downtown districts, and as well as key individual properties and some of the ways that your local programs and volunteers can be engaged in those efforts, and to recognize two recent Illinois Main Street communities. The title slide has photos of Marshall on the left and Macomb on the right. They are two of the newest Illinois Main Street towns with downtown National Register of Historic Places districts. So congratulations to those communities. Before we proceed with the content, a couple of housekeeping items. We're using the GoToWebinar interface today, so you'll be able to watch and listen via a couple of methods. One is through the mic and speakers of your computer, or alternatively you can dial in via a telephone. Furthermore, you'll be able to answer me questions, and if I'm smart enough, I'll try to answer them. So there are also a couple of ways to do that. One is to type your question at any time during the broadcast into the question box, and that's actually the preferred way, just so we stay on time. Alternatively, if you really have an urgent question, you can raise your hand, but that'll probably throw me off. So I would just prefer if you type them in, and then I'll answer them at the end. Additionally, the webinar is being recorded, so you'll receive a follow-up email with a survey, a brief survey, and a link to the recorded webinar after it is over. But without further ado, let's talk about historic designation, what it means and what can you do about it, and why should you care. So there are 4 levels of historic designation in the United States. The topmost, the most prestigious, if you will, is the National Historic Landmark Program, which is reserved for places of national importance. The tier below that, which is itself composed of several tiers, is the National Register of Historic Places, which will be our topic for today. Then most states have state historic registers. Illinois has one too, but it has been closed for years actually, so it doesn't really so much apply in Illinois. And then there is local landmark designation, which is historic preservation at a local level, and that actually is where a lot of the protection occurs. The other programs don't really provide much protection for historic properties, as we'll discuss. But the topic for today really is the National Register, and it's not because local landmark designation isn't important, but National Register can provide direct economic incentives that can assist in the revitalization of your downtowns. And also it has the least potential of conflict because, as we'll explain, it does not invoke regulations and reviews that are typically associated with local landmarks processes. So really, while we're talking about historic designation, and this discussion is about that, it is equally about economic development. So even if you don't have an interest in preservation, I hope that this presentation is still valuable to you because of the economic impact potential. So what is the National Register of Historic Places? Well, the official definition from the National Park Service, which administers the program, is the National Register of Historic Places is the official list of the nation's historic places worthy of preservation. authorized by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. The National Park Service's National Register of Historic Places is part of a national program to coordinate and support public and private efforts to identify, evaluate, and protect America's historic and archaeological resources. That's great, and I'll spend the rest of the program talking about how great the National Register is, but I do take issue with one phrase, and I wanted to point it out to you, which is worthy of preservation. I think that this can be sometimes taken out of context and misinterpreted to imply that if a building is not listed in the National Register, then it is not significant, which is obviously false. One way to think of the National Register, and I'll just call it National Register for short, otherwise the name's so long, that National Register doesn't provide historic significance to resources. It recognizes it, and it recognizes it through a very specific standardized process. So simply because a resource isn't listed in the National Register doesn't mean that it's not significant. The reasons why it is not listed may be because it was never, the listing was never pursued, it was never evaluated for listing. Or it could be that even if it was evaluated, that just because it doesn't meet the specific requirements of National Register listing, once again, doesn't mean that a property isn't historic or that it cannot be significant. So I just wanted to get that out of the way because it does come up. So in terms of what is listed on the National Register currently, there are nearly 90,000 total listings nationwide. And those listings comprise almost 2 million total contributing resources. The reason why the number of resources is much larger than listings is because a listing could be for an individual building or for a district that would have hundreds or sometimes even thousands of resources in it. And it is a program that is active, and there are properties listed anytime, all the time I should say, with nearly 1,200 properties listed in fiscal year 2012. The resources that can be listed in a National Register are of enormous breadth and variety, and that's one of the reasons why it's such a great program. These range from prehistoric Indian mounds to Italianate mansions, or they can be 1890s train stations, or 1950s apartment complexes, WPA post offices, or mid-20th century roadside attractions. And these are just a few examples of the various types of resources that can be listed in the National Register. There are additional requirements that have to be met. One is that a property should be at least 50 years old in order to be considered for listing, but there certainly are exceptions. One that comes to mind, there are many, but one that comes to mind, for example, is the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, which was built in 1965, and then it became a National Historic Landmark just 22 years later in 1987. So, and in order to be considered for NHL status, you have to be on the register first. So that's clearly way less than 50 years old, and that's because it's an exceptional resource. But so that's the 50-year rule is a rule of thumb, and for historic districts it's actually easier to justify younger buildings. They don't have to have exceptional significance like individual properties do. And in addition to age, a property has to have sufficient integrity as well. So it has to retain its design characteristics, its materials, it's citing just historic association that allow for the interpretation, for the understanding of its historic significance. In terms of types of National Register listings, I already hinted at this. They can be individual, and they don't really have to be buildings even. The USS Lexington in Corpus Christi, Texas is listed on the National Register individually. That's the photo of it here. They can be districts, and obviously they can be residential or downtown commercial districts like we'll talk about for your communities. And then the third hybrid, if you will, is called a multiple property listing, which can consist of individual properties and or districts. So a multiple property listing is a way to list resources that relate thematically but may not necessarily be bound or confined to a geographic area that you can draw a boundary around. An example of that could be cast iron facades of Baltimore, for example, which are individual buildings scattered through Baltimore that you couldn't draw a boundary around because you would have lots of other buildings that don't relate in between, but through a multiple property listing, that's a way to get those properties recognized. Then another one that is much larger in scope would be historic residential suburbs in the United States from 1830 to 1960, and that's another large context document that allows various suburban residential suburbs to be recognized. So there are several ways to nominate a resource in the National Register. In addition to the age and integrity requirements, a property has to be historically significant under at least one criterion, and there are four criteria, National Register criteria, labeled from A to D. Criterion A deals with significant events and activities. Criterion B has to do with significant persons. So, for example, if a nationally or locally prominent figure lived or worked at a building, that would be a reason to employ criterion B. Criterion C recognizes buildings for its architecture and engineering. And criterion D, archaeology, recognizes a property's potential to yield information. So a property or a resource can be significant under multiple criteria, but it only has to be significant under one. And if you want to nominate it for more than one, you have to build a case for each criterion independently. So the easiest thing to do is to nominate it under one criterion, because that's all that is required. This aspect of the National Register I particularly find useful, and it allows it to be utilized throughout the country and in rural and small areas as well, because it has several levels of significance where we don't have to consider everything for national importance. The basic level, the first level of significance is local, where all we have to do is evaluate a property within the local context, within that community that it is located in. So in this example, we have this wonderful sheet metal facade in Vermont, Illinois, and we don't have to compare it to buildings like it in Peoria, Rock Island, Chicago, anywhere else in the state. We just have to look to Vermont. And since there is nothing like it in Vermont, then that's sufficient to make a case for its significance. The next level would be statewide, and that obviously raises the bar, if you will, and we have to build a case, evaluate the resource for its potential statewide significance. An example of that would be a state governmental building, for example, or a property associated with a person that has an impact on the entire state. So a state capitol is probably the easiest example to demonstrate that. But another example would be a property, a type, let's say an architectural example that is so rare that there are only few examples of it remaining in the entire state. That could be another way to build statewide, a case for statewide significance. And the last level of significance is national. So this is where you obviously raise the bar once again and have to evaluate properties for potential national significance. And this is a prerequisite for the National Historic Landmark Program. And an example of this, as shown on the picture, is the Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois, by one of the most important 20th century architects, Mies van der Rohe. So those are some of the basics of requirements of the National Register of Historic Places. But why should you even bother to do this? Why is it important? Well, it's because it provides a number of various benefits. The first and the easiest, the most common sense, if you will, is prestige. National Register recognizes historic significance of places, and so many people are interested in attaining that recognition, and that's why they pursue listing. And for most people, or a lot of people, that's all that's necessary. They do it for the honor that's associated with being placed on the register. Another benefit which is related to the prestige is the heritage tourism potential. Many people seek out historic places, authentically historic places, and if you consider National Register as a marketing program, it can be used as a tool to attract visitors to your community so they can experience these historic places. National Register has been around since 1966. There are, 1.7 contributing resources listed in it nationwide. It's a very well known, understood program, and it can bring tourists to your community, and that obviously has its own benefits. The other two benefits, protection, quote-unquote protection, and economic benefits, I'll discuss separately in detail on the following slides. So a lot of people think that National Register prevents people from doing things to their buildings, which translates to some sort of protection. Well, I'll explain what kind of protection it offers. So first, any activity that receives federal or state funds, licenses, or permits must be reviewed to determine whether it will negatively affect any historic resources. What does that mean? Well, it means that it basically has little or no impact on privately owned properties. The state or federal permitting is related to projects like highway road work, sewage plants. Bank constructions requires an FDIC permit, so that would trigger that review. But other privately owned buildings, for a vast majority of projects, these types of permitting funds or licenses will not apply. So these properties are then not afforded the level of review that would come with it. The other important thing to keep in mind is that historic resources are defined as properties or resources eligible for National Register listing. And so buildings don't have to be listed on the National Register in order to trigger this review. They have to simply be eligible. And that determination of eligibility is made by the review agency at the time of their review. So the bottom line is that regardless of whether you don't have anything in your town listed on the National Register because you fear that the federal or state government will come to your community and tell you what to do, if there are those projects that trigger state or federal review, an agency will determine whether resources being impacted are eligible for National Register listing, and if they are eligible, then they will pursue with the review. They will treat them as if they were listed. So that's a very important thing to understand and to make a distinction of or between actual listing and eligibility and how this review process occurs. So basically, if you're scared of the National Register because of what it can mean in these very limited instances, you're denying yourself the benefits that come with it for something that will occur regardless of whether a building or a district is listed on the National Register or not. So I hope this makes sense. If not, I'll try to answer this later too. Additional forms of protection. Under many building codes, properties listed in the National Register may be exempt from meeting certain requirements that would destroy character-defining features. So if a building code that's being employed would require widening of a doorway that would then remove some decorative features or other changes, or if the pitch of this historic staircase doesn't meet modern code, but that would require replacing it with its decorative features, character-defining features. Depending on the building code, the National Register listing comes to the rescue, if you will, and there could be exemptions for that. So it actually provides for some leniency and ways to mitigate certain changes that would otherwise be either both expensive and both detrimental to the historic character of a property. And then the only real protection, and I say real with in quotation marks because it really is indirect, is that by listing something on the National Register, we're kind of elevating this perceived historic significance of the property in the minds of the public, of the local community. So we're indirectly protecting a property by recognizing its significance. So it's the National Register listing becomes an indication of support, recognition, or of value to a certain segment of the community that has pursued the listing. So it shows that someone thinks that a building is important, and if that provides it some protection, again indirectly in terms of community planning or redevelopment, let's not touch this property because it's listed on the National Register, not because we have to leave it alone, because the National Register doesn't prevent us from doing anything, but clearly this is a significant building to the community. We should, treat it as such. That's really the extent of protection that is afforded. So, really. Now, the other rather significant component of benefits are the economic benefits. So there are very real financial incentives available to owners of buildings listed on the National Register. The biggest one that also has been around for a long time is the 20% Federal Historic Preservation Tax Credit, which is for commercial properties. And basically, to sum it up in a sentence, a building owner receives a federal income tax credit that equals 20% of his or her total expenditure on the rehab of that building. So if you spend $100,000, you will get $20,000 back of credit that you can use towards your federal income taxes. And then there are other requirements that must be met: minimum expenditure, and the work must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. There's a 3-part application. I will cover all of this in next week's webinar on May 23rd. So if you want to find out more about the specifics of the 20% tax credits, please sign up for that webinar. But this is a very significant incentive that has spurred redevelopment in many communities. There are state incentives that can layer on top of the federal. many states have tax credit versions that, or state tax credit versions that mirror the federal. And this is not yet in place in Illinois, but the process is underway, and we could have one fairly soon. There is a pilot program that's available in 5 communities now, but Landmarks Illinois, with its legislative caucus, is working on the statewide version, which I believe is being considered in the House of Representatives right now. So it's underway, and it could come. And the way to access that benefit and to double the benefit of the federal incentive would be to get your property listed on the National Register, and the time to do that is now, before the floodgates open and everybody is trying to tap into this incentive when it becomes available. So the state tax credit would be another 20 or 25% on top of the 20% that the federal tax credit already provides. There is also a property tax assessment freeze in Illinois, which is for single owner-occupied residential properties, and that also is for properties on the National Register. The listing also opens up some grant eligibility for both planning and brick-and-mortar projects. Grants are typically very competitive, so nothing is a given. But once again, a way to tap into these, to even compete for these grants, a lot of times is through a National Register listing. Generally, these grants are for public and non-for-profit entities, and in some instances, they require a higher level of significance, but so not local, but statewide or above. But once again, the gateway to that is the National Register. So, oh, and by the way, to sum up economic benefits, the ones I presented, they don't include tourism dollars that can be generated through heritage tourism activities. So really, and those are, depend on community, from community to community, depend on how well historic tourism is integrated into the overall marketing plan, into the approach, but they can be significant. So any disadvantages? Well, I think the best way to answer that is to tell you what National Register of Historic Places is not. So first, listing places no obligations on private property owners. There are no restrictions on the use, treatment, transfer, or disposition of private property. That's it. So any rumors or myths you have heard to the contrary are false. Listed buildings are not required to be restored or open to the public. Listing on the National Register has no impact on the value of a property or the taxes paid on it. Now, if you rehabilitate your property and your property is reassessed, then, the value of it will go up, but that's regardless of whether it's listed on the National Register or not. But like the property tax assessment freeze and the tax credit programs, they recognize the investment that's required, and they recognize those facts, so they offer incentives to both help for the rehabilitation and to offset potential reassessments. Additional things that the National Register is not. A property will not be listed if for individual properties the owner objects, or for districts a majority of property owners object to the listing. So, nobody can, for individual buildings, will list your property if you don't want it to, and for districts, majority of the owners can object and defeat a listing if they so desire. And last but not least, National Register listing does not automatically invoke local historic district zoning or local landmark designation. I think this is where a lot of people are confused, because it is possible, and it does often happen, that a property or district that is listed on the National Register is also a locally designated landmark or historic district. but the review and the protection that is afforded to those buildings comes with local landmark designations, local zoning, local ordinances, not the National Register. But because the two are often not simultaneous, but you can have both designations, the blame is shifted on the National Register, and it's quote-unquote blame. And sometimes local historic preservation commissions consciously don't correct that perception for fear that they would have to, deal with it in a different manner. It's much easier to blame the non-existent review and not deal with it. So National Register takes the blame or credit, if you will, for something that, depending on how you look at it, for something that actually occurs because of local designation. So that's very important to make that distinction. Now, if you're really looking for disadvantages, there are perhaps some, and so for full disclosure, we'll list them here. The biggest one, I think, is having to put up with the myths and lies that come with the listing process. And, you constantly have to deal with it and answer questions and deal with people that know better, that they know of buildings in other communities that, people were told what to do because buildings were listed on the register. So, which again is false, except for the state or federal permitted projects and for tax credit projects which are voluntary. So nobody forces you to take a tax credit, but if you want to take it, then you need to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards. But you are not forced to do anything. So these myths and lies come with every time just by invoking the National Register name. The other disadvantages, and I hinted at this or talked about it with the definition of the program, this worthy of preservation phrase, there's a certain perception of exclusivity. So if something is not on the National Register, it must not be that important. Well, that's obviously not true, and we have to be aware of that. So the definition of the register and what it's trying to do is not misused by opponents of historic preservation locally, and to get rid of properties that either were not evaluated for listing, or even if they don't qualify for listing, may still be very important locally. Once a property is contributing within a district, contributing to the historic significance of a National Register district or individually listed, it does no longer qualify for the 10% non-historic tax credit. So we are taking an incentive away by placing a building on the register, but we're providing one that's twice as lucrative. So buildings, we're taking away the 10% non-historic tax credit for buildings built before 1936, but we're providing one that's 20%. And then again, if you have a state tax credit, then that could be even more than double that amount. The next two disadvantages are related. The listing is a bureaucratic and lengthy process. There are reviews at the state and federal level. It takes a long time, several months to a year or longer, to complete a National Register nomination, get it reviewed, get it corrected, present the nomination to the state advisory council, and then wait for the National Park Service to approve it. Because it's such a rigid and a prescribed process, it often requires professional consulting to accomplish. However, that is not a requirement, and anybody in theory should be able to complete a National Register nomination, and many people do. But those are some of the disadvantages, or not some, the only real disadvantages that I can come up with. And the last two are not necessarily disadvantages of actual listing, but rather of the process to pursue the listing. Once the properties are listed, nothing happens. It's just you are listed until, if the building's demolished, then at some point presumably it could be delisted, but that's all that would occur. So now, how to pursue the nomination? Well, you can, it should start by obtaining a preliminary eligibility determination from the State Historic Preservation Office, which in Illinois is IHPA, the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency. It's the first step in the listing process. It basically, by providing some information to the agency, they're letting you know that, yes, we think that this property is eligible and it would qualify for listing, and that gives you the green light, if you will, to then pursue the actual listing process. So for districts, you would present your proposed boundaries and talk about why they're significant in very preliminary fashion, and then IHPA would be able to tell you that yes, we think you should proceed, or no, we don't think it qualifies. So the preliminary is a good step because it prevents you from doing unnecessary work. If it cannot be listed, then you know that from the beginning. And then once you have that green light, you complete a nomination form. There are too many really steps to explain here, but essentially a nomination is a research paper that proves the property's historic significance. So you describe it physically, what it looks like now, you describe the changes that occurred to it, and then you describe it why it's significant under one or more of those 4 criteria that I showed early on. Okay, so that's what the National Register is: benefits, disadvantages, how to get it listed. How does all of this translate to Illinois Main Street towns and programs? Well, hopefully I've demonstrated that the benefits of listing are pretty significant. So, and Main Street approach is a preservation-based approach. So one should conclude that this is a program that should be utilized by most Illinois Main Street communities. It's sort of a basic, important but basic gateway kind of foundational program to historic preservation to access financial incentives and so on, prestige, heritage, tourism, the list goes on. Well, so let's see who in Illinois has downtown National Register districts. There are currently 16 towns with downtown National Register districts. These are shown in red. Plainfield is underway, so there are 43 towns in the program currently, 16 towns, that's 37%. So for a foundational program of historic preservation, and for the Main Street approach being a historic preservation-based approach, this is a low percentage. This means that our towns don't utilize this program well. Plainfield is listed because that process is underway, so they don't have the nomination completed yet, but it should be completed this year, so we'll give them the benefit of the doubt and list them as one of the 16. But that 16 can be further broken down into newer and older districts, and I'll explain why this matters. Since 2000, there have been 7 towns with that pursued and accomplished downtown National Register listing. Momence is the oldest of these with 2006. Marshall and Macomb are the newest. Plainfield is forthcoming. Dixon, I think, is about a year old. Now, the reason why this matters is because we have this age requirement. So we have, in order to be considered for National Register listing, a property has to be at least 50 years old most of the time. And so that criterion, that requirement is used to determine where to draw the boundaries and where to, which properties then would be contributing and therefore eligible for these incentives. So these 7 towns have newer districts, and they have basically state-of-the-art nominations where everything that could be eligible and everything that could take advantage of the incentives is. But we have 9 towns with what I would call ancient downtown National Register districts, which are 30 years old or older. The oldest of these are Belleville and Golconda, which were completed in 1976. And so if we take Belleville, for example, with its nomination completed in 1976, follow me here because this is important. When finished in 76, that means if we go 50 years back from that date, that would be 1926. So that means that everything built up to 1926 would be considered contributing, and the boundaries would be drawn around, district boundaries would be drawn to include buildings that were built prior to that date and exclude buildings after that date. So if we completed a nomination today, the cutoff would be 1963. So in case of Belleville, we have buildings built between 1926 and 1963 that are A, excluded from the district, or if they're within a district, they would be considered non-contributing and therefore not eligible for these incentives. So these old nominations, while great, they're problematic in that sense because, again, they do not allow the maximum of number of buildings to be within the district, and for contributing buildings, for buildings that could qualify for these incentives that we were discussing. So these districts need to be updated to expand their period of significance, significance determinations, and potentially boundaries. Maybe boundaries need to be larger. Now I can tell you in case of Golconda, and this is no slight on Golconda, but there hasn't much that's happened since 1976, so you probably don't need to revise that nomination. But Springfield, Quincy, Alton has several districts, actually. Bloomington, these larger communities that have seen activity since the 1970s or early 80s when this building was completed, and buildings in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s that we now would consider historic are not given the benefit of historic designation within these districts. So just because you have a district doesn't mean that you're done. Now, the most worrisome number, though, is that 27 towns of the 43 Illinois Main Street programs don't have National Register districts. 63% of them do not. Now, some of them have tried to get it. Some of them are actively pursuing it. Berwyn, Jacksonville are 2 that I know of. Others maybe have not. And maybe not all of the 27 can attain it. But you should at least try. And that's something that can be done at the local level, can be spearheaded by your local Main Street program. So, so at a minimum, these 27 towns need to figure out whether they have district listings that are possible. So contacting IHPA and getting a preliminary determination. That's what needs to happen with these communities. And even if you don't, let's say your town can't qualify for listing on the National Register, which for some of these can happen, there would be individual properties that could be listed on the National Register, and that's another project that your local Main Street programs can spearhead. So so don't think that just because you have a district or don't have a district, or you don't have an eligible district, that key properties that could be redeveloped and could be listed on the National Register, that this shouldn't be pursued. Now, there's another layer to add to this, is that 19 towns, 19 Main Street towns have what's called a certified local government status. So that means they have Historic Preservation Commission that fulfill certain federal criteria. And what's important to our topic today is that these Historic Preservation Commissions qualify for grant funding from IHPA. And there are several communities right now that are preparing National Register nominations with these certified local government grant funds. So here's a list of these communities where maybe it's not, maybe the Main Street program doesn't have to do much, but maybe they just need to talk to the Historic Preservation Commission, make them aware of the status, you know, sort of start a discussion. Hey, how is our National Register district? I watched the webinar by this Polish guy, and he sounded really intelligent. I'm just kidding. And you know, maybe we should update our district, or has anybody looked into having a district here? Here are the benefits, here are the downsides. I think we're eligible for grant funds. Can we do this? So even something as simple as that is what you can do. But I think I got ahead of myself. Here's a list of what local Main Street programs can do. Start with a preliminary eligibility determination from IHPA. You can contact the National Register coordinator there. You know, again, look at districts, key individual properties, do that initial homework that then may allow you or another group or a consultant to prepare the actual nomination. You can take it as far as that. Moments did it in 2006. This was all a volunteer-led effort. They did all the research and wrote the nomination themselves. So if they can do it, anybody can. And they didn't have a background in historic preservation, consulting or research or anything like that. So, but you can look at an old nomination if that's what you have in your district and revise it. You can create a new one, or you can do some of that initial work, such as develop just an inventory of your buildings, or initial historic background research that can be useful in future efforts to list your downtown. And then for those of you that have certified local government status and Historic Preservation Commission, engage the commission in the discussion, and don't assume that they know exactly what's going on. They're volunteers just like you are, and you know, they may think that, oh, we have National Register status, we got it in 1976, so we're fine. And you know, that's great, but it needs to be updated, and they may not know that. So don't assume that somebody else is working on this. It's something that you can at least bring to the attention of other people. If not, do it yourself. So 7 towns don't have to do anything for now. We've showed you which ones those are. Those are the ones with newer districts. And it's not that they don't have to do anything. They should still be promoting the incentive and potentially working on individual nominations. 9 towns should update their districts, and 27 towns should at least figure out if it's possible to get one. And then 19 towns can take advantage of CLG status. So that's really the intent of today, is to introduce you to the National Register and to raise the need to make it happen in your communities. With the state tax credit possibly coming on board very soon, this is a real incentive that could be available in your towns, and most of our towns don't have it. So, you know, it's important to do other design activities, other preservation activities. I don't want to discourage, you know, streetscape and benches and storefront remodelings that you do by yourselves, but this is preservation and economic development hand in hand. This could mean a difference in your community Um, and it's the type of planning and economic development that your Main Street programs can and should be doing. So I really want to encourage you to think about this seriously. You can visit IHPA's National Register site. Here's the web address for that. There you'll find the staff contact info, the preliminary submission requirements, other descriptions and requirements that you should follow, and the National Park Service's National Register site is very good. It has everything, sample nominations, bulletins talking about how to complete nominations. All of that is discussed and explained. So, and if you have additional questions, you can also contact me. But I hope this was useful, and I noticed that there are some questions throughout, so I will try to answer them now. Go through here. And feel free to type additional questions as you think of them. First question, do communities typically complete National Register District applications in-house, or do they farm them out? Both ways. If there is in-house talent, if you will, and the talent is not so much about talent but perseverance, then communities can do it themselves. If there is a planner on staff with the background, sometimes planning staff can do it. Other times volunteers of Main Street programs do it. And other times consultants are hired to do so. And sometimes it's a combination of these efforts. For example, for this certified local government programs, those are 70% funded and 30% match grants, but the 30% match, local match, could come in the form of in-kind donations, and local Main Street programs, historic preservation commissions often provide those services to satisfy grant requirements, and then the consultant completes whatever else needs to be done. Another question, is using TIF funds to pay a private firm to complete a national register application recommended? Well, I don't know if it's recommended or not, but it is a TIF eligible expenditure. So yes, if you have TIF funds, that would be a great investment of that. Another question, how long should the process of establishing a National Register District take? Well, from start to finish, I would allow a year. It could be longer, it could be less. It depends on how much preliminary work you do before you approach IHPA and the Park Service about establishing the boundaries. It's a lot of the times that preliminary step before you get your boundaries approved that takes a while. Then you have the actual nomination writing time, and again, that depends on how big the district is. Is a consultant involved? Are there volunteers involved? Who's doing it? If there is a grant cycle that you have to fit this within, then you'll have a deadline that you have to complete it by. But a year is not unreasonable. It's typical. A lot of times it can be under that, and sometimes it could be over that. But if there aren't any difficulties, which most of the time there aren't, a year is a good sort of a time frame to estimate for. Another question. Regarding significant persons, does someone like Al Capone qualify? Famous or infamous but a criminal? Yes. It doesn't have to be good history, it just has to be history. Does that affect the judgment of the nomination? No. There are a number of different examples of historic significance, what constitutes significance. You know, there could be sites of infamy or fame, and again, it could be local and all the way up to national significance. So history is history. It's just we have to determine how significant it is. It doesn't have to be pretty. So, for example, slavery sites are obviously, it's a dark area of our history, Underground Railroad, but they also it allows us to talk about the positive things that people were doing during that time. So, massacre sites, there are certainly other examples of areas and properties that are darker areas of our past, but they are nonetheless important, and yes, they would qualify. Can we get a copy of the presentation? Absolutely. You will get a link to this recorded webinar. If you actually want the presentation, just if you wouldn't mind dropping me an email, and I can email you a PowerPoint. And then looks like two more questions. Does having a CLG designation help getting National Register designation? Well, it doesn't help with the designation, but as I explained, it may open you up to eligible funds. CLG status certainly helps, and like I said, there are several communities, some Main Street, some not, that are pursuing National Register listings through the CLG grant funds. So that appears to be the last question that I saw. So without further ado, I want to thank you again for your participation today. If you think of additional questions, feel free to contact me, and I hope this was useful. So, and I look forward to presenting to you next week regarding historic preservation incentives. Thank you very much. Have a good day.